The emergence of the Turks is still a question that plagues linguists. We don't have nearly the information that we would like to have on, say, the development of Indo-European languages. What can be said about the Turks is that they emerged apparently in the Orkhon Valley. That would today be in the center of Mongolia. And one of the ironic aspects about Turkish expansion is that the Turks essentially lost their homeland. They have relocated themselves to new homelands on the Central Asian steppes, in the Tarim Basin, also on the Western steppes, and they have spread their language across the Near East in what today would be Turkmenistan, parts of Iran. Those would be the Azerbaijanis who speak a Turkish language, and above all, Turkey. The concept of Turkey doesn't really emerge until the 14th century AD, and ironically, the majority of Turkish speakers are essentially in Turkey, Iran, and Turkmenistan, regions very, very far from the Turkish homeland of, say, the 5th century AD, which is now the homeland of Mongolian speakers. The Turkish languages, which are closely related and show far less divergence than Indo-European languages, and there's several reasons for that. One is they diverge from the parent Proto-Turkish language relatively late. Some linguists would say in the 1st century BC, others would say in the 3rd century AD. The languages are still very close. They break into essentially a Western and Eastern branch, and then a Northern Lear branch, which is almost extinct. There are only a few peoples who speak versions of that Turkish in Russia today. But today, a modern Turkish speaker in the Republic of Turkey, in, say, Ankara, would look at the Turkish of Azerbaijanis, of people of Turkmenistan, and say, well, it's Turkish, but not quite right. And then when they got farther east to where today you have the Uyghurs in eastern Turkestan, you would have Uzbeks, they would say, well, that Turkish is related, it's a little weird, but they could still make a great deal of sense, not only of the words, but also of the syntax. All the Turkish languages share certain grammatical features that are very important in designating them. One is they are agglutinative languages. That is, they're languages that stick together, monosyllabic combinations. Everything is done by suffixes to indicate the function of words. This is peculiar not only to Turkish, but also to the Mongolian languages. And the Turkish and Mongolian languages are a larger branch known as Altaic languages. And there are a couple of other families to it, but those are the two main families that survive today. Furthermore, they show very similar tendencies and traits in grammar, in the way the verbs are treated, in what is known as vowel harmony. That is, Turkish languages only have 8 vowels, 4 in one class, 4 in another. Pure Turkish words should always have words only of that single class. There are no diphthongs. There are no 2 vowels coming together. And there are numerous other features that keep these languages close together. It is not only a function of time, that is, they diverge from each other much later than the Indo-European languages diverge from their mother, but it's also the nature of nomads. That is, there's a constant reinforcing of traditional Turkish as nomadic peoples cross the steppes, as different Turkish groups intermarry and assimilate, and there's a tendency to keep a certain homogeneous feature of the Turkish languages, which doesn't happen when people settle down and the languages become generalized among many non-Turkish speakers. There's lots of loan words that are borrowed. This is seen very well in 2 modern Turkish languages. One is Uzbek, which has been heavily influenced by Persian languages. Another one is the Turkish of the Turkish Republic, what we would call Turkish. It has shown enormous amount of influences from Arabic and Iranian in grammar and language, loan words as we call them, as well as certain concepts. Nonetheless, in the 5th century AD, all of these Turkish tribes spoke languages that were probably mutually intelligible and may better be called dialects. And they really don't diverge into independent languages until probably at the end of this period in the 11th century. Now, what I wish to do in this lecture is to look at 3 major Turkish confederations that emerge between the 5th and really the 9th centuries AD. These confederations in some ways are similar to what we saw under the Xiongnu that is the confederation of the really the end of the 3rd, 2nd century BC that poses a threat to China. And in this lecture, I want to concentrate a lot on the Turks themselves. We will talk a little bit about China. The interaction between China and these Turkish nomads we shall reserve for an upcoming lecture. In any case, the first confederation we know about emerges in the 4th century AD, somewhere in the 330s, and there are a group of rulers who go by the name of Khan, Ka'an to be more exact, and that gives rise to names such as Kagan, would be a modern rendition of it in English or in European languages, but that G is really a soft G, a glide in Turkish. It's Yamashak K is the technical term. The Avar Khans, who put together the first significant confederacy of Turks on the steppes. They would be centered again on those eastern steppes, particularly on the Mongolian grasslands. Now, there are several features or several advantages that the Turks had acquired by the opening of the early Middle Ages. One of these is superior saddles, and with superior saddles, stirrups. We believe as early as 300 AD, nomadic peoples had devised what is often called the leather loop stirrup. It's essentially a toe hold attached to a rather high back saddle that would give you more support in riding. It would assist the archer in steering his horse and using both hands for his weapon. Well, these leather straps gave way to metal stirrups. And metal stirrups are attested certainly from the 4th and 5th centuries AD on. They are very, very quickly adopted by the Chinese. And when we talk about the clash between the Chinese and Turkish armies in the Sui and Tang dynasty, the Chinese are armed just as well as their Turkish opponents with better leather saddles and that metal stirrup. There also were certain improvements in the composite bow. And above all, the Turks turn out to be extremely skilled metallurgists. They perfect the forging of iron and steel. In fact, the name Turk, which comes to become a general name for people speaking all of these related languages, that's a term that was originally applied only to those speakers of Turkish living in the Altai Mountains who were really vassals of the Avar Khans. And they got their claim to fame because they were excellent metal workers. They could produce fine armor, the conical helmets, the various scimitars and battle axes needed for close order fighting. And so at the start of what we would call the Middle Ages, certainly by the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the Turkish nomadic warriors are far better armed and equipped, have far better saddles and stirrups than any of the earlier nomadic peoples, the Xiongnu, the Tocharian speakers, the Saka, the groups that we have discussed earlier, and antiquity. And therefore, they are a far more formidable cavalry force. And invariably, these nomadic armies now have a component of what we would call heavy cavalry, lancers, men who could close and fight in close order. They have the body armor and the weapons, as well as large numbers of horse archers who would open the attack by harassing the enemy, wearing them down, luring them into a premature attack. All of the Khanates that we're talking about, the Avars, the Gurk Turks who follow them, and then the Uyghur Turks, all of them field similar armies, similar type of armored warriors, horse archers, and they employed the same tactics and strategy. And remarkably, these tactics and strategy will dominate the battlefield really into the 15th century. And as I've mentioned before, it's only the advent of firearms that really undermines this entire system of fighting. And you have to understand that these Turks are trained from birth to fight as warriors, to hunt. In fact, the famous kind of polo game played by Turks still survives across Central Asia and into Mongolia, buzkashi, which is a rough and ready polo played with the carcass of a goat. And it's a pretty brutal sport, and a sport that also trains you for the kind of expert horse riding that would require men to ride within 10 or 20 yards of the foe, shoot arrows into him, flee before the enemy can even react, then turn on a dime to counterattack should the enemy give you that opportunity. Well, the Avars, as best as we can determine, were Turkish speakers, and from 330 AD or thereabouts down to a rebellion that was carried out by their subject Turks in the Altai Mountains, a man named Bumin, who in 551, 552 overthrew the Avars. They dominated the eastern steppes based on these armies. And they were able to negotiate terms with the dynasties then ruling in China. And we will return to these dynasties in China in the upcoming lecture. And these included particularly Chinese emperors of what are known as the Northern Wei dynasty. And what they really were related Turks, called in Chinese sources the Toba people. They have a variety of names, who've established themselves in northern China, in the Yellow River Valley, along the Great Wall, although the Great Wall is falling out of use because they really don't have the resources to maintain it. And they are nomadic warriors trying to rule northern China in the guise of Chinese emperors. They also clash with the Hephthalites, probably Tocharian-speaking people who succeeded to the empire of the Kushans, who attempted to dominate the Tarim Basin and the cities of Transoxiana. That is, those wealthy caravan cities that really net so many advantages to the nomadic peoples. So the Avar Khans repeatedly negotiated with the emperors of the Northern Wei. They exchanged embassies as well as lots of border wars with the Hephthalites. And as a result, they get in on part of that trade, again, to acquire the silks and the other goods that allow the Khan to rule a confederation of inner and outer tribes. Well, I mentioned that very abruptly, somewhere in 551, 552, a vassal ruler of this confederacy, a man named Bumin, who ruled a group of people who come to call themselves the Gurk Turks. And the Gurk Turks means the sky Turks, the celestial Turks. Gurk is still a Turkish word for sky. It means the blue sky. It's associated with the blue color. And it's probably a Turkish version of the notion of the son of heaven in Chinese ideology. They overthrow the Avars very rapidly. It's essentially an internal rebellion. And Bumin had a private quarrel with the last Avar Khan. He had been denied a royal marriage. There had been really had been some kind of dishonoring of him. And his followers were particularly well armed because they had been the people producing the weapons that armed the confederacy of the Avar Khanate. And as a result, Bumin, who dies soon after the rebellion, establishes the second great Khanate on the steppes. He seizes the traditional regions, the Orkhon Valley. He is acclaimed Khan by probably an assembly that already resembles the Kurultai, that is the assemblies of rulers, of khans and princes, who give their approval to the man who will lead the confederation. And this is a feature of not only various Turkish confederations, but also the Mongols. You have to be approved by this assembly. Don't mistake it for democracy. It's an assembly of the greater ones. Now, the significant point about the Gurk Turks is they do not confine their activities to just the eastern steppes, the Tarim Basin. They are responsible for a very rapid expansion of the Turks across the central and western steppes. In the course of the 6th century, Turkish speakers now extend all the way into those Pontic-Caspian steppes, penetrating to the shores of the Black Sea, to the steppes around the Caspian and Aral Seas. And they come into contact with the Sassanid Empire and the Byzantine Empire, as well as with the various kingdoms in China. They're not yet quite reunified until 581 under the Sui dynasty, but this Turkish confederacy borders on all three of these great literate urban civilizations. And that expansion sees several important changes. It begins a linguistic transformation of the steppes. The Turks prove extremely adaptable in learning as well as assimilating other steppe peoples who up until this time, mostly spoke Iranian languages. And between the 6th century AD, when literally Bumin gives his brother, Ishtemi, his younger brother, the commission, look, you go west, you pursue the Avars, who eventually they end up in Western Europe. They actually end up ultimately in Hungary, trying to flee the Turks and enter into alliance with Constantinople in part to escape their overlords, their would-be overlords, the Turks. He tells his brother, Istemi, you run these guys down and bring the various other steppes under control, which he very successfully does. And after Bumin dies, either in 552 or 553, shortly after he overthrew the Avars, this Khanate essentially divides into two. There is the Eastern Gurk Khanate, centered on the traditional homelands, and there is a Western Gurk Khanate, which centers on the central lands and has aspirations to bring the western steppes under control. This is not just a matter of lateral succession, but also a matter of size, that the military abilities of the Gurk Turks are so great, they're able to incorporate so much of the steppes under a single confederacy that forces a political division because of questions of time and communication. You have to remember that Bumin is ruling in the Turkish heartland, in what is today central Mongolia, close to the later capital of Genghis Khan, and that is 3,000 miles away from where his brother is operating on the shores of the Caspian or fighting the Sassanidid Shah in Transoxiana. And you just cannot rule this state from a single center. And so this partition of great Khanates becomes a feature ever after, and it is a major feature of the Mongolian Empire, the Mongol Empire conquered by Genghis Khan and especially his grandsons. The second important point I mentioned, of course, is that you have a major linguistic and ethnic transformation going on. That is, Turkish languages now become the language of the steppes, and with that comes a sort of cultural koine that unites the various steppe peoples henceforth. And also, this is a matter of power. The Khanates, the Gurk Turk Khans, have military power on an order that no one has seen on the steppes, really, at least the central and eastern steppes, since the time of Modu Chanyu and the Xuannu. Well, this Eastern Khanate runs into trouble. It draws the attention of the Chinese emperors, particularly the Tang emperors. And the Tang emperors in 618 unify China into a great military state. And they immediately target the northern lands as a region to bring under control. And we'll be discussing the Tang emperors. They find the reintroduction of that tribute system, that is providing Chinese brides, bolts of silk, in exchange for some kind of submission, as well as access to the horses of the steppes. That is unacceptable. And the first Tang emperors rule virtually as generals and conquerors themselves. And I will argue to some extent they are products of the martial society of northern China. And as a result, the Tang emperors wage major wars against these Gurk Turks. The fighting climaxes in a campaign in 629-630, when the Chinese general, and he's well known from his military manuals, a man by the name of Li Jing, is commissioned to wage a major campaign against the Eastern Turks, and it is a perfect strategic operation and envelopment. He nails the army of the Khans, destroys them with the kind of tactics we've discussed before, and as a result, the Eastern Khanate collapses. Thousands of Turks are captured. They're sent back to China to serve into the Chinese army or settled as colonists. In 657, Tang armies also inflict a serious defeat on the Western Turks in Central Asia. And by 657, really down into the 680s, the central and eastern steppes are literally being ruled by the Chinese emperor. The Tang Emperor, the Second Tang Emperor Taizong, could style himself not only as the Emperor of China, but also effectively as the Khan of the nomadic peoples, the people of the felt tents. And this was a major achievement. No other urban civilization, organized army of the entire Middle Ages or even of antiquity ever won such victories as the Tang Emperor did. However, this could not last. And the Tang Empire went into a decline, particularly brought on by the An Lushan Rebellion, which breaks out from 755 to 763. We'll discuss that in the upcoming lecture. But what happens is that the weakening of the Tang dynasty allows the Turks to reestablish their independence. They shake off the control of the Tang in a rebellion in 680, 681. And we have a remarkable set of inscriptions that were set up by these later restored Turkish Khans in the Orkhon Valley. And these are the earliest examples of Turkish. They're written in a runic script, a script that looks a lot like Germanic runes, but is unrelated to it. And in it, the man who is what is known as Yabgu, that is a subordinate Khan, his name is Toyukuk. He put the Khan on the throne, the Khan Bilge, and he has a long inscription, which is quite significant because it's the first time we have direct evidence from these nomadic peoples. And Toyukuk, warns his Khan and his people not to become too assimilated by Chinese ways, not to build Taoist temples, not to build Buddhist stupas, to be careful in the material culture, and above all, not to lose the military virtues. This is an issue that will be raised again in the Mongol Empire, as well as Turkish tribes who enter into the Islamic world. The inscription, which is today, and the whole site, which is regarded as a World Heritage Site, is known to all Turkish speakers today. Any Turk would know, yes, that is the first Turkish that we have, and the modern Turkish languages are still fairly closely related to that early form of Turkish from the 720s. Those inscriptions really marked the height of the Turk Khanate. Within 20 years of those inscriptions, the Khanate collapsed. It was overthrown again by subjects, that is a subject tribe of the Confederation who are also Turks, between 742 and 744. A new group of Turks known as Uyghurs. They are known to people who have been following the news in the relationship between the Uyghurs and the Chinese in Chinese Turkestan or Xinjiang. Today, we used to call it Xinjiang, but they're not there yet. They're actually on the Mongolian steppes. The Uyghurs construct the third Khanate. In some ways, they represent a new improved Khanate over the previous two. Their power doesn't extend as far west. Essentially, the western zones, even much of the central steppes, was loosely affiliated with this Khanate. But the Uyghurs are important for several reasons. One, they very quickly come to embrace Manichaeism. There is an official conversion to that faith brought by Sogdian merchants. The Uyghurs developed their own script, ultimately based on the Brahmi script. They quickly also established settlements. They turned their tent encampments into what looked like incipient towns. And the Uyghurs established a very, very close relationship with the caravan cities and with the later Tang emperors. And that results in important cultural influences emanating from China and from the caravan cities of the Silk Road entering into the eastern and central steppes. And that is one of the most important roles they play. And as a result, the Uyghurs, among all of the Turks, were regarded as the most accomplished and civilized. This is, for instance, documented in their political dealings with the Chinese Empire. We know of 13 different Uyghur Khans. 7 of them, essentially half, married Chinese princesses. And these would have been women who arrived from the Tang court. Some of them were of the imperial family, others from high members of the court. They would have arrived with great retinues, would have been received by the Uyghurs, that was essentially equivalent to grand caravans, and with it came artisans and entertainers, scribes, and the Uyghurs were extremely receptive to all of these cultural influences and really enriched the society of the Eastern Steppes. They were tolerant of all the religions, even though they favored Manichaeism. And when we turn to the Mongol Empire, the Uyghurs were regarded as the natural administrative staff for the Mongols. Genghis Khan immediately starts, as soon as he's on his world conquest, he's using Uyghurs to run his empire. They also allow the dissemination of Nestorian Christianity and Buddhism across the Eastern Steppes. So on the eve of the unification of the Mongol tribes by Genghis Khan, many of the tribes are already Buddhists, some are Nestorian Christians, there are still some Manichees. Many of them have departed from their traditional animist religion. Well, the Uyghur Khanate also lasts for about a century before it too is overthrown. And again, it is overthrown by subject tribes. The capital is destroyed in 845. It's abandoned, and the successors, these Kyrgyz Turks, who are the ancestors of today, the Turks of Kyrgyzstan, they essentially overthrow Uyghur power and then leave. And many of the Uyghurs migrate into the cities of the Tarim Basin and eventually merge with the sedentary populations and bring their language and their traditions there. Well, I want to stop with a couple of conclusions about these three Turkish Khanates. They were the dress rehearsals for the Mongolian Empire, the great Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan. And second, they forged more impressive political organizations and brought the Turks into contact with the settled civilizations very intimately. And above all, with the civilization of Islam, which is soon to emerge. And it is the great interaction between the Turks and Islam that will change the life of the steppes and also change the emerging Islamic world.